The conversation around Afrika Bambaataa's funeral has taken an unexpected turn, especially after a deeply emotional tribute by Jazzy Jay began circulating. What was meant to be a final farewell has now become something much bigger, a moment that is making people reflect, question, and revisit the legacy of one of hip-hop's most influential yet controversial figures. At first, the updates about the funeral seemed simple, a gathering of close friends, artists, and pioneers, a space where people who helped build hip-hop culture would come together to say goodbye. But as more details started to emerge, it became clear that this wasn't just about mourning. It was about confronting a legacy that has never been easy to define. Afrika Bambaataa has always been a name that carries weight. Known as one of the founding figures of hip-hop, he played a major role in shaping the culture during its earliest days. Back when the Bronx was still discovering its voice, he wasn't just playing music. He was organizing communities, bringing people together, and pushing a message of unity through sound. His work with the Zulu Nation became a symbol of peace and creativity during a time when the streets were filled with tension. For many, he represented the very foundation of hip-hop culture. The beats, the message, the movement, it all carried his influence. And because of that, news related to him has always drawn attention. But over the years, that attention changed. What people noticed just before the recent discussions around his funeral was how divided public opinion had become. While some continued to respect his contributions to music, others struggled with the controversies that surrounded him later in life. These were not small conversations. They were serious, emotional, and often uncomfortable. And that's what made the funeral so significant. It wasn't just about remembering the past, it was about deciding how that past should be viewed today. As people began arriving at the service, there was a quiet tension in the air. This wasn't the kind of gathering where everyone shared the same emotions. Some came with admiration, others with hesitation. There were artists who had worked closely with him, and there were those who had chosen to distance themselves in recent years. Still, they all showed up. That alone said something. The setting itself was respectful, simple, and focused. No unnecessary extravagance. Just a space where people could gather, reflect, and pay their respects in their own way. But beneath that calm surface, there was a sense that something important was about to happen. And that moment came when Jazzy Jay stepped forward. At first, nothing seemed unusual. He approached the stage calmly without any dramatic gestures. The room quieted down, but there was no immediate shift in energy. It felt like the beginning of a standard tribute, something people expected. But then he started speaking. He didn't begin with grand statements or emotional exaggeration. Instead, he started with memories, simple ones, stories from the early days of hip-hop when everything was still new and uncertain. He talked about block parties, late nights, and the feeling of building something from nothing. Those moments felt real. They reminded everyone in the room of a time before fame, before controversy, before everything became complicated. And slowly, without forcing it, the emotion began to build. Jazzy Jay spoke about Afrika Bambaataa not just as a public figure but as a person, someone he knew personally, someone he shared experiences with, someone who had been part of a journey that changed music forever. But what made the tribute stand out was what came next. Instead of avoiding the difficult parts of the story, he acknowledged them. He didn't go into details, he didn't try to explain or defend anything, but he didn't ignore it either. He simply recognized that the story of Afrika Bambaataa is not one that can be told in a single tone. And that honesty changed everything. People in the room could feel it. There was no attempt to control the narrative, no effort to make things look perfect, just a quiet acceptance that some stories are complex and that complexity doesn't disappear even in moments of farewell. And that's when things began to shift. The room, which had been calm and reserved, started to feel heavier, not in a negative way, but in a way that made people more aware of their own thoughts. Some looked down, others stared ahead, completely focused. It was no longer just a tribute. It was a moment of reflection. Jazzy Jay paused at one point, and that pause said more than words could. It gave everyone time to process what they were hearing, what they were feeling, and what this moment really meant. And then he continued. He spoke about the impact of music, how something that starts in a small neighborhood can grow into a global force, how the early pioneers never imagined the scale of what they were creating, and how, despite everything, that impact remains. But what happened next caught people off guard. Instead of ending his tribute with words, he turned to music. There was no announcement, no build-up, just a soft transition as a beat began to play in the background. It was subtle at first, almost easy to miss. But as the sound grew clearer, people began to recognize it. It carried a sense of nostalgia, a reminder of the early days when everything felt raw and authentic. And something changed in the room. People who had been sitting still started to move slightly. Heads nodding, eyes closing, memories returning. It wasn't loud or energetic, it was quiet, controlled, and deeply emotional. For a brief moment, it felt like time had gone backwards. Like the room wasn't a funeral anymore, but a reflection of everything that came before. And then, just as quickly as it began, the music stopped. The silence that followed was different from before. It wasn't uncertain or tense. It was full of thoughts, emotions, and unspoken understanding. After the tribute ended, reactions started to spread almost immediately. Those who were present described it as one of the most honest and powerful moments they had witnessed, not because it was dramatic, but because it was real. And that's what stayed with people. Not just the words, not just the music, but the feeling that the moment had not tried to be anything other than what it was. Of course, outside the room, the conversation continued. Some people praised Jazzy Jay for addressing the situation with honesty and balance. Others felt that more should have been said or that certain topics should not have been included at all. And that's where things became complicated again. Because the legacy of Afrika Bambaataa has never been simple. There are those who see him as a pioneer, a cultural leader, someone who helped shape an entire movement. And there are those who believe that his later controversies cannot be ignored or separated from his legacy. Both perspectives exist, and neither one is going away. But what the funeral, and especially Jazzy Jay's tribute, did was create space for both of those thoughts to exist at the same time. It didn't force people to choose one side. It allowed them to feel everything. As the service came to an end, people began to leave quietly. There were no loud conversations, no dramatic exits, just individuals processing the experience in their own way. Some stayed behind for a while, sitting in silence. Others shared brief words with each other, not trying to explain anything, just acknowledging the moment. And in the background, there was a sense that something important had happened. Not something that would change opinions overnight, but something that would stay in people's minds for a long time. Because sometimes the most impactful moments are not the ones that give clear answers. They are the ones that make people think. The ones that challenge simple narratives. The ones that remind us that people and their legacies are rarely one-dimensional. In the end, the conversation around Afrika Bambaataa's funeral is not just about the event itself, it's about what it represents. A closing chapter, yes, but also an open question. How do we remember someone who had such a powerful impact, yet such a complicated story? There may never be a single answer to that. But maybe that's not the point. Maybe the point is to keep asking the question. And to understand that sometimes, remembering is not about finding clarity. It's about accepting complexity.